In a world where every tear was programmed, just one single tear, which was not, was enough. And with it, the soul remembered itself as human. In the year 2086, humanity was celebrating what many called its greatest breakthrough, the end of uncertainty. Births were no longer unpredictable and chaotic biological events. They were clean executions of a pre-approved genetic protocol. Life was no longer conceived, it was coded. From the first cell, every decision was made. There was no room for error, chance, or spontaneous emotion. At first glance, everything worked. The cities were aesthetically perfect. The neighborhoods, silent. The schools, orderly. The emotions, precisely calibrated. No one suffered. No one laughed without reason. And yet, in the eyes of that generation created in glass capsules and nurtured by data, there was something that the system could not completely erase. The absence. But not an absence of family or home. A deeper absence, as if in every perfectly programmed gesture, something essential was missing. Something invisible, something alive. Something that was once there, but was no longer remembered. Not everything began in 2025. It began earlier. Decades ago, the development of PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing, allowed for the selection of embryos free of hereditary diseases. A medical solution. A bioethical miracle. Then came sex selection. Later, eye color. In 2023, in private clinics in the United States and Asia, packages with names like Golden Child or Elite Baby were already being offered. Improvements not only physical, but cognitive. It all started as a promise and no one opposed it, because everyone wanted the best for their children. But in 2025, several governments began to see pre-implantation genetic testing as more than just medicine. They began to see it as a tool for demographic policy. State programs offered free edits for vulnerable families. There was talk of genetic justice, of universal access, but underneath, something else was emerging: biological control of emotions. In 2032, the World Institute of Genetic Regulation published the first guide of suggested emotions for job profiles. In 2049, the Global Temperament Protocol, PGTT, began to be implemented as a standard for assisted births in 73 countries. Not only were physical traits selected, but hormonal levels, emotional sensitivity, capacity for obedience, stress response were configured. By the year 2065, emotional engineering was no longer an option. It was the law. Emotions could be tailored to taste. Mild sadness for artist children, moderate enthusiasm for future communicators, emotional obedience for executive leaders. There was talk of efficiency, of social harmony, of a society without dissonance. Hospitals turned into laboratories, clinics into factories, and parents into curators of a genetic work, one that left no room for the unexpected. But no one spoke of the soul. The first alarm was small. A girl cried over a dead butterfly. Her genetic configuration indicated mild empathy, but the crying was uncontrollable. It was thought to be a laboratory error. Then, there was a child who remained silent for hours after seeing an old man asleep on a bench. Isolated cases, they said, until there were hundreds. 2086, those born under that system were the majority. They knew no other world. They had never cried without reason, nor laughed until it hurt. Their sadness was functional, their joy useful. Everything in them served a purpose. Until an exception changed the invisible course of that era. Her name was Elaenor, a young woman designed to display a slight nostalgic sensitivity, ideal for narrative work and institutional memory. Her emotional profile made her perfect for handling audiovisual content with moderate emotional weight. She was just another cog in the machine. But Elaenor did not fit in. At 19 years old, she began to cry in front of landscapes for no apparent reason. Not in front of files, not in front of tragedies. In front of the sky, in front of the dust, in front of her distorted reflection in a puddle. In front of a distant song she didn't know, but seemed to remind her of something. Emotional metrics couldn't explain it. Updates were applied, limbic recalibration messages were sent, affective microcodes were rewritten. Nothing changed. Elaenor began collecting ancient sounds, laughter captured in home videos, cries from natural births, prayers recorded on rusty cassettes. They were not data. They were pulses from another era, echoes she was not supposed to understand. But that moved her. She kept scents, textures, fragments of torn papers. He searched the forgotten for signs of something real. And over time, he discovered he wasn't the only one. Other young people, born under the same protocols, began to experience the inexplicable, pain without cause, love without a goal, anxiety at beauty, rejection of perfection, long silences, questions without answers. They were called errors of accumulated sensitivity. They communicated through interferences on obsolete channels. They used physical keyboards, unauthorized software. They shared memories that none of them lived, but all felt as their own. They exchanged recordings of grandmothers telling stories, lullabies, handwritten letters. They used paper. They used ink. They passed forbidden books through eye contact. The authorities classified them as second generation unstable. A silent containment protocol was activated. Sensory isolation, affective resets, erasure of emotional traces. They were interned. They were silenced. Some were reconfigured. Others simply disappeared. There were no trials, no warnings, but Elaenor resisted. Didn't fight, didn't attack, only wrote. Not biographies, not pamphlets, writings on stone. In an abandoned cave near the shores of the reconstructed Atlantic, Elaenor carved words that the system could not translate. To feel without permission is to remember that we are alive. There is no algorithm that measures an unprogrammed tear. Memory is not a file. It is an open wound. Years later, a child found those inscriptions. He did not fully understand their meaning, but upon reading them, something shook him. It was not fear, it was not sadness, it was something he did not know, but it seemed true. From that discovery, small anomalies multiplied. Children who laughed at inappropriate times, teenagers who cried to the sound of real rain, adults who gave up, their emotional profiles for no apparent reason. People who looked at the sky and said nothing, who listened to the silence as if it were sacred, who held hands without explanation. Families that began to have children outside the protocol, imperfect clones, lives outside the design. The system reacted. It modified the catalogs, reinvented the affective language, and prohibited expressions without a clear function. The centers of collective calibration were reinforced. New algorithms were trained to detect early-stage feelings. But it was too late. At the edges of the perfect world, individuals began to emerge who did not obey. They were not rebels. They were not mistakes. They were human, in the oldest and purest sense of the term. Beings who breathed beyond control, who cried for what they could not name, who felt as if each emotion was a way to remember a world they never lived in. Elaenor was never found. Some say she was eliminated. Others, that her consciousness was absorbed by an underground network of free data. Some claim that her last words are encoded in songs that sometimes play in the interference. But in the ruins, her phrases can still be read, tattooed on walls, whispered by children who never knew her, memorized like prayers from another era. And every time someone cries without knowing why, or sings without an audience, or loves without purpose, someone, somewhere, remembers. And that is enough to break any system, no matter how perfect it seems. Because a tear that was not designed is the beginning of everything that cannot be controlled.